Hey guys, it's Robin, our Silent Crafts, and welcome to my craft room. This week we're going to go ahead and start doing some stitches on our Floral Heart Embroidery pattern for the 6-inch hoop. I got this free from Cutesy Crafts. The designer is Jessica Anderson. I'll go ahead and link up in the iCard to the first video. I know it's been a couple weeks, but I've been trying different ways to film this video, and I haven't been able to get one that works in those fancy dancy ways that the other people that do the embroidery stitches do. I've decided, forget that. I should know better, and I'm just going to go with what I know that I can do and what works for me in my setup. I'm not going to have my stand out. You're not going to be sitting down. I won't be sitting in a chair, and you guys won't be looking over my shoulder. We're not going to do any of that fancy stuff. I'm just going to stick with my normal tutorial stuff. I have everything right here in front of my table, and so what if I have to stand up to do the stitches? I like to stitch and hoop anyways. I don't normally put the embroidery in a stand because when you're doing a design like this, to work this design, you end up, like driving a car. You're going to be moving your little hoop like a steering wheel all over the place. Setting this in one spot in some type of a embroidery stand or cross-stitch stand, it just doesn't work for me. There's a lot of times unscrewing things and getting it adjusted. If you have one that just clamps and holds it really quick and easy, it's not too bad. But we're going to try this style. So we might have a little bit of growing pains while I'm getting used to it. You guys can tell me what is not working and what is working. If you can't see something or you need me to redo something, you guys are really nice and sweet in the comments, and I'm sure you'll let me know if there's any issues. I have all my stuff over to the side. I've got all my different floss. I have my little trash container that I save all of my cut off ends when I'm doing embroidery. I'm going to be using these in an art quilt, so I save all those. I have a pin cushion so I don't leave my pin anywhere where I will step on it or my cats will eat it. I have my little snips, some type of little scissors that are nice and sharp to cut your floss. I have this container from my daughter's watch. I don't think she realized that she was giving it to me, but when she showed me the neat container, I'm like, oh cool, I love containers. She's like, all right, you can have it. So as I'm using the floss, I'm going to go ahead and store it in here. That way, I'll always know that this green is this green. Because if I put it back into this mess, I may never find that green floss again. So as I'm working on a project that's going to be a long-term one, it's going to take me a while with multiple colors, I like to find some type of a container, one of those old plastic containers from Coal Meat, a Ziploc bag, any type of little plastic container you have, or a metal tin. I have my little pin holder where I keep my extra needles, my little needle book. My pattern. We're going to practice the stitch on this first, and then we're going to make it on that. Don't worry. Oh, and my Friction pen so I can draw on here and we can make the stitches. Don't worry, this is going to be the only time I'm going to show you this whole setup, just so you get an idea what I have. I also have this little Altoids mint tin where I keep my beeswax and a couple needle threaders in case we want to use that. I don't always use the beeswax on an embroidery project like this. When I'm using 6 strands, I tend not to use it. When I go down to a couple, then I might want to, because that's when they tend to get a little more twisty and stuck together and tangled. Now, as you can see, I've already done a little bit of stitching on here. That's because I had already tried to film a video once that didn't work, and I didn't see the point in taking that out because we're going to be making plenty of these. It's going to have all about the same. I have the identical, well, not identical, but the same design over here. And a lot of these stitches are going to be the same. So we're going to be able to repeat them, so we'll be okay. Now you want to make sure you read through your pattern so you know exactly what's going on before you get started. It has been taped together because I cut this out when I was showing you how to put it in the back of the hoop to trace that way. I don't normally do this, and I just didn't see the point in printing out another one when I can just tape this together. Now it states up here that all stitches are made with 3 strands of floss unless otherwise noted. Like you'll notice down for your satin stitch there'll be 6 strands. Woven wheel is 6 strands. And then all stems are a stem stitch. That means all of the things like right along here, that's the stem of the flower. and this stem here, they're all done in the stem stitch. But now remember, once we learn these stitches, if you don't like the stem stitch and you like something better, you can always change up the stitch. Just because the designer suggested that this is the way she did it, you don't have to follow that rule. She's not going to come knocking on your door, bang, 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 bang. Hey, Robin, you did it wrong. It's going to be okay. It's whatever you like. This is just a good guideline to get us started, and as we get going, even if we do a stem stitch here, we can come down to this one later and change it up to a back stitch or something else. It's okay. Like I said, these designs are always going to be yours, just like with quilting, and you can change things up and do it any way you want. When you print off these free patterns, a lot of times it's an already finished design that they're showing you, and then when you print it off, you have your black and white design, so you can see the colors they use. As I mentioned before, she has listed all of the colors she used here, but I'm just going off my black and white, and I'm just going to choose colors that work for me that I like. If I wanted it exactly like hers, then I would go ahead and follow this through, and I'd make sure I have my phone or my tablet or my computer laptop set up with this picture on it so I can look and see that she used, okay, here's a blue and a light blue. Let's see exactly where she used it. Like she made a blue flower and a pink flower. If you like the overall the way she did it, then you can follow with her colors right there. If you want to be creative, let's just go crazy and use whatever we want. With this many flowers and stitches, plus they're flowers come in all different colors, it's going to all work together when we're done. So what I decided to do the first time is I was going to do this little, it just looks like a weed to me. So I'm going to do the stem stitch on here. Then these little parts that come off of here are done in the straight stitch, and then we have French knot. So right off the bat today, we're going to go ahead and learn 3 different stitches. We're going to learn the straight stitch. We're going to learn a stem stitch. And we're going to learn some French knots. Now the next time we do French knots, I'll go ahead and I'll show you the colonial knots. But for this time, I only want to show you the one version of the knots because there's 2 different ways you can make them. But I don't want to confuse you. We'll just do one today because there's plenty of places. All these little dots are going to be the French knots, so we get plenty of time to practice both types of knots. So that we can see really well, I have this cream colored floss. I'm using 6 strands, even though it tells us to go ahead and only use the 3. For our practice one, I'm going to put a knot on the back. I don't normally knot on the back of my design. As we get going, I will show you how you can weave in your ends as you go and bury your threads so that you don't have these lumpy knots on the back. But the straight stitches are very, very simple. You're just going to come up. Now, a lot of your directions say come up at A and down at B, come up at 1 and down at 3. That part always confuses me. You definitely need to watch the picture when you're doing that. But I'm just going to go ahead and say we're going to come up at one point and we're going to go down at the next one, and that is a straight stitch. See? Easy peasy. Up in one spot. Let's zoom you in a little bit so you can see really well. And down at the other. You see this little piece of thread peeking through right there? That is my tail from the back that is just sneaking its way in. So I'll just pull that out. And there we go down. Up here. And down there. And that's it for the straight stitches. When we get to our project, these little pieces that come right off of here between the stem and the French knots is the straight stitch. It's so small, you're just going to do 1 stitch in each spot, and that's all that needs. Now for our stem stitch, that's going to be the part that's the stem of our flowers. That's going to go through these 3 areas. If we were to just take a straight stitch and go boom, boom, it would be really loose here. You'd be able to catch it with your needle and you could hit it with your nail, and eventually it would come even looser and it'd be flopping around, so then your design wouldn't look all that nice and neat. When you first start out, Your stitches might not be perfectly even, but you want to kind of take it a little slow at first and not worry about speed. Speed will come later. Don't worry about how fast other people get it done. Just take it nice and easy and making sure you're making your stitches nice and neat. The evenness, the using the same length all the way through, that'll come later, as the speed will also come. So when we're going to do our stem stitch, which works really well in the stem of the flower, we're just going to come up in one spot. Now you see how mine kind of curves up and then down? You want to have your floss here following that curve. So because the curve goes up, I'm going to keep my floss at the top of my hoop. I'm going to try not to get hooked around that little screw there. I'm going to keep it at the top, and then I'm going to go down about a stitch length over. And as I pull it down, I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm keeping my loop here at the top. Okay, so here's my little stitch length. I have my loop at the top because that's the way my stem is going, and I'm going to come up in between the two of those. And I'm going to come up right on my line. And as I pull it slowly, I'm going to allow that stitch right there to come down to the top of my fabric. I'm going to give it a little gentle tug, but I'm not going to pull on it hard and make anything pucker. So once again, I'm going to go about a stitch length over, but I'm going to make sure that my floss stays up above my line, and then I'm going to pull this down. Once again, not pulling all the way through. Now I'm going to come up right about where the last stitch ended right there. You can come up in the same hole, you can come up right next to it. Pull it through and let that piece of floss go down. And then I'm just going to keep working my way over. I can hold it up at the top here. I'm going to go down a stitch length over. Don't pull too fast. Come back in, right near or in that hole, and then when I pull this down, it's going to go ahead and land on it. I kind of, since it's going over the top, I give it a little tug up. Now we're going to start going down this way, so when I put my next stitch down here, this is for when you really have these big dramatic curves and stuff. It's not always going to be necessary. If you're going to be doing a straight line, just decide if you always want your loop on the bottom or on the top. So I'm going to pull it through again. This time I'm going to leave it at the bottom, just so you can get an idea of how that's going to look. Come back up through there. Now this is going to allow me to curve down if I needed to. I like to hold that one piece with my thumb just so that I don't accidentally pull it through all the way. And this allows that to make that little dip down. It allows you to go down and around bends. You can go around straight corners almost that way too. We might have some gaps in this video where I'm just actually stitching and you're not going to hear a lot of talking, because you don't always want to hear me saying the same things over again. Up, pull, down. I'll do that a little bit in the beginning of the stitch, but we really don't need to repeat over and over again. Now I'm going to go ahead and just go a little bit past where that one ended, and I'm going to go ahead and end off my stitch. And there's my stem stitch. Now as you can see, mine is not super neat and tight. I don't think while I'm doing things on the camera it's going to get really pretty, but as you get stitching, and when you're using just a 3 strands instead of the 6 like the pattern calls for, it's going to make it a little bit tighter and a little bit neater. Now since I'm right here, I'm going to show you how to finish off a thread. We have all these loops on our back, and I'm just going to go ahead and weave in and out of them, and that's going to secure the end of my floss. 4 or 5 stitches depending on where you're going. Now it's nice to finish off under the same color that you're working, but it's okay also if you're putting it underneath another color, because we did put the the interfacing back here so that we don't see when things are moving around too much when our floss starts traveling. Plus it's a tight enough design that you're not going to notice things. Now we're definitely not going to take this green and go all the way down here with it. We're going to cut it off and start over again. But if you were using, let's see where one good example is. Okay, here, like these are really close, so you can definitely go over. When you're doing this design, you might want to just sneak over there and finish that one up. You won't have to cut your threads for that. But anytime you're moving long distances, more than, let's say, an inch, you really want to cut your thread and begin again. Let's do a couple French knots while we're right here. So we're going to come up wherever our dot is. Sometimes with French knots, they don't even bother to put the dot. When they transfer these patterns, sometimes they say, okay, I know there's going to be a French knot at the end of each of these little lines, so I'm not going to put it in there. Because my ink is going to, I'm using that Friction pen, it's going to disappear when I go ahead and hit this with the iron and put some heat to it. I went ahead and I put all the little dots there because a lot of times after I transfer the pattern, I don't look at it again because I know what I'm doing and I'm just going to kind of guess. I don't remember if I mentioned this in a video I deleted or one you saw, but I put a little painter's tape on it and I stick it on the wall above where I sit down and stitch so I can easily glance up at it, but I don't want to have to look at it too much. Like this one, I already know that I'm going to be using 3 strands for most everything except maybe the satin stitches and the French knots, so I might not even look at the pattern again. Okay, so with the French knot, we're going to come up at that knot. We're going to come up at that little dot there. And what we're going to do is I'm going to hold my needle and I'm going to wrap my thread around it once, twice. Now I'm using 6 strands, so that's going to make me a large enough knot. It's not always they say how many times you wrap the needle, it's how many strands of floss. So if you wanted a really big French knot, you would go ahead and use more strands of floss and you do up to 3 of your wraps. Anything after that, and it tends to get a little wobbly and messy, and you don't want to have loosey-goosey French knots that are just dangling off your fabric. So wrap it once and twice, and then you're going to go down near where you came out, but not in the exact same hole because that would just pull your floss all the way through. And I'm holding, this is the floss that came off of the knot right here. I'm holding it in my left thumb and I'm supporting it in the back with my finger. And then I'm just going to use my right hand because I'm right-handed, and I'm going to pull that floss through gently and slowly. And when it gets a little closer, I'm just going to let my thumb slide up and hold it. And then when I let go, it's just going to secure it. And I have a little knot there. Now I don't secure every single knot on the back, like I wouldn't tie off and knot the floss every time. But after about 2 or 3 of them, I would go ahead and I would knot off the thread on the back, not like a knot, but to weave it under. And maybe to take it like this, sometimes I'll go under. And I'll go under the next one or the same one. And I'll do like we do when we're sewing a knot. I'll just go ahead and go through that loop. And then I'll secure that off with a little tiny, now this is not a knot like we did at the beginning here. This is just the kind of like knotting it off when you're doing your sewing thread. I know a knot is a knot, but this one is big and this one will really be felt on the back. And this one's going to lay down nice and flat. And if something were to happen and one of these 3 French knots were to come undone, I wouldn't lose all my French knots. Like say I was traveling all around my pattern and I decided to do all of these in a dark green, and I decided that I was going to go ahead and just travel all the way around and do all the French knots. Now that's not something I plan on doing. I'd do a couple here. I could sneak underneath this flower after it's already made and put a couple French knots there. And that way if I tie off from here, if these came undone, then these would still be safe. Other than the French knots for these flowers here that I've decided I'm going to do in the same color, or I might do it in a lighter color, I might change my mind. I usually leave these loose French knots that are just decorations sitting all over. I save those to one of the ends so that I can go ahead and sneak under flowers. So like I can go from this one here, I can tie it off in this flower and come out the other side and make these. You see how that works? But I thought since these are right at the end of these flowers, those wispy little things, that I might go ahead and just do those now while I'm right here. So let's do another couple French knots just before we start into our main project. I went up. French knots are like the only time that it's helpful if you have it in some type of a stand. I like to just hold it up against my belly, and then when I'm pushing on the hoop here, that it's going to put pressure against my stomach and hold my hoop, and that way it makes it easier to do the French knots. But I'm just trying to do it here in front of you guys, and I don't have my big belly in the way. So I'm just going to wrap around my needle twice. Bring it down closer to the fabric so that I can hold this down and put my spot. Now, if these came loose a little bit while you were doing it, like mine just did a little bit, you can kind of hold the needle. I have it between my fingers down here, and then I just give this a little bit of a tug to tighten up those knots. Then I can go ahead and pull this through, which makes it a little bit harder. There you go. Be gentle but firm. And there's my knot. One more, and then we'll go work on our project. So it would be no different than if you were left-handed. Let's see if I can do this. You're just going to wrap it around twice. Then you're going to go down near where you're next to, like 1 or 2 threads over. You're going to hold this with your right hand and pull this through. Go slow. It doesn't have to go super fast. Let it guide right underneath your thumb. You don't even have to look at it. And there's your French knots. Now, since I don't have anywhere, well, you see how this is already getting loose in these wooden hoops? You have to keep kind of pulling on these. That's why I like the plastic ones with the lips a little better, because they stay tight longer. Now with this French knot, because I don't have anywhere else to weave it under, I would go under this strand here. And when this loop came up, I would go ahead and grab that loop and just give myself that little bit of a secure, firm, not so knot. Once again, it's very small. This one's quite large. And then I just snip it off, leave myself about a 1/4 inch or so. They say not to leave your needle in your fabric like this because it could leave holes in it. I know that I'm not going to be, well, first of all, this is just a practice piece, right? But I don't mind putting my needle all the way out here because I know that I've made my fabric larger and that I'm going to go ahead and trim it down. But you could always just keep it in your needle book there. Or if you don't have to worry about animals or kids, you can leave it in your pincushion. Let's set this one aside. Now these French knots are teeny tiny. These are going to be only with 2 strands. And our stems is going to be with 3 strands. So let me show you how to get 3 strands of floss so that we can start working on those stems. There's a couple ways of separating the floss. Now the official fancy way is you're supposed to kind of like tap down on the end here a little bit till it kind of spreads out a little, and you're going to pull out individual strands based on how many you need. There we go. So since we're going to need 3, I would pull out 1, lay it down neatly. I'd pull out a 2nd and lay it down next to the 1st, and then I could pull out the 3rd. Then I could pick these back up. Try not to lose any or get them tangled. I would just go ahead and even them back up at the top as best you can, and then you can trim the ends a little bit so you can get it into your needle. And there's your 3 strands. Now these are going to lay nice and flat and neat. They're not going to be a mess. They say even if you're going to do 6-stranded that you should separate all the strands because within the floss they're already twisted. And this way it untwists them and it'll lay nice and flat and nice and neat. You see how it lays like that? And this one is 6. So this one has a nice flat ribbon look to it when I lay it down, and then this one is all twisted like a rope. So a lot of times you want to have a nice flat look to it, and then this one will tend to curl and twist around more. Now that being said, let me show you how I do it. I have all 6 strands just sitting here. I still go ahead and fluff it up a little bit. I just split it in half since I'm going for 6, so I put 3 in one hand and 3 in the other. I just kind of grab that end with underneath my fingers and hold the other one with my thumb. And then with my left hand, I just put my finger in this little Y here, and I just slowly pull it, and I let this untwist. And then I reach back up, kind of smooth that out, and then I just keep untwisting. And then when it's all separated, I just go ahead and separate it like this. And then I have 2 working strands. I can do 3 at one time and then 3 the next time. Some people will just separate and grab the 3, and then they'll just start pulling this, and as it knots up at the bottom like that, they just let it go. And then after they pull out the 3 they needed, they just kind of shake it down and let this one untangle. So there you are, 2 or 3 different ways to go ahead and separate your floss. This is still a nice long strand, so I'm just going to wrap this around my bobbin and save it for when we need it. Now if you wanted to use beeswax to keep everything from being too twisted, I go ahead and just leave this a little bit short tail up here. Then you just hold the wax and you just pull your floss over it a couple times. Some people do 3, some people do 2, some people are crazy and do 5 or 6. 2 is usually good for me. And then it puts just a little bit of, I don't know if you can hear that, but it puts a little bit of a squeak to it. I put this part shorter because as you're waxing it, I don't want this part to get stuck to the other one, and it's just easier that way for me. Once again, it's putting beeswax on a floss. I'm not sure if you can really do it wrong unless you leave big chunks of wax on it, right? So we're going to go ahead and work on this one since I've already done that one. And we're going to do the stem stitch right through here. And this little part here is also going to be a stem stitch. We're only going to get like 2 stitches on there. These are going to be our straight stitches. And then we're going to go ahead and have our French knots there. So we've got 7 French knots. We got 7 strands because, you know, they all go together. And then 2 of our stem stitches. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to start your very first strand now because there's nothing around here. If I were to go ahead and start working in this section, then I can tuck. See how I don't worry about my backs being too messy. It's not like cross stitch where everything can be nice and tidy. I'm sure some people have them nice and neat, but I tend to have a little bit of a mess. If I were starting in a spot right next to it, I can just go ahead and tuck my floss under here, weave it in. But when you start your very first stitches on your project, you're never going to have anywhere to weave it under anyway. So I think I'm going to go ahead and start. Because I have to weave in my thread, I'm going to go ahead and start with this long one first. I'm going to start at this end so that when I work my way down here, it'll be a short distance to go there. If I started here and went all the way up, then I'd have to get back over to there. So I just bring my needle up right near the end. I'm going to be taking my straight stitches all into this base here, so I'm just going to go a little bit of an 1/8 of an inch past where those are all going to meet, just so I don't have too many threads going up in the one spot. And I'm going to pull it through and I'm going to flip it over to the back and I'm going to leave myself 1 inch or 2 of tail. If you have too much, you can always cut off the excess. It's easier to hold on to it if you have a little bit extra than if you went too little. Now we're going to go ahead and do our stem stitch, remember, so I'm just going to go down a little bit. And I'm going to decide to go ahead and keep mine at the top. Can you hear how you can hear? It's a different sound when you're pulling through with the wax than if you don't have your wax thread. And since my thread is wax, it's just going to sit there nicely for me and not go anywhere. I'm going to go ahead and just, I can take my needle, you see it up there, and I can just pick a spot and just kind of slide it down so I can easily glide it to where I want it to be. Because sometimes it's hard to just stick it right into the line of where you're going. It's going to be really hard to see everything without fingers being in the way because you're embroidering and you're going to have to be right here. But we're going to do the best we can. See, tight as a drum. I really enjoy that sound. So I'm going to pull this through. And when I do my next stitch, I'm going to go ahead and flip it to the back, and I'm going to make sure that when I go back up that I'm going to be putting my floss over my tail, so that's going to lock it down in place. So I have it up a little bit, leave my loop up at the top. When I come back up through, I'll pull my needle through just a little bit, and I'll flip it back over, and I'll see where my loop is here, and I'll just make sure that I take my floss and that it's laying down into where my loop is. Now, if you don't want to go through and deal with all this, just go ahead and leave yourself about 3 or 4 inches, whatever you think will work of your floss end. Just leave it over to the side, and you can come back through and pop it onto your needle and then just weave it through after you've already made all your stitches. I just kind of make sure that as I'm pulling it through, that it's going to go ahead and just cover over that end. You can kind of see the end right through here, so you can always kind of make sure you bring it down so that it goes in line with your line. Make my next stitch. Flip over, make sure I'm not, see now this time I did not catch the tail at all. I'll just pull that stitch up a little bit. And then I'll pull my tail through that loop. If you catch it 2 or 3 times, you're doing good and it'll stay in place really well. Once again, it's this in this style of a design that we're doing, it's not going to be, kids aren't going to play with it. It's not going through the washer and the dryer all the time. So we just make sure it's locked down. Now I can come back through later and go ahead and trim this tail. Sometimes when I'm working on other areas, it'll automatically catch that tail again anyway. And then I finish off my stitch right there. And there is my first stem stitch. See how it looks like the braiding of a rope? You know how rope goes kind of twisted like that? So it looks nice there. Go ahead up a little bit on this one. Now I could come back down here and start, whoops, sorry. I can come right back down here and start where it hits the stem, or I can just go up a little bit. I find it's easier to go down exactly where you need it to be than to try to come up exactly where you need it to be. Then I could take my needle and I can just kind of move my stitches a little until I see exactly where I want to put my needle. Now remember, I've got you guys zoomed in. When you're all the way out here and this is hanging on the wall, if you don't get in exactly the right spot, it's not going to be noticeable. And if someone gets really, really close to the wall, just kind of pop them on the shoulder or the head, and they'll stop looking at it that closely, right? Bring my hoop and keep it up to the top. I've got a little bit of a smaller stitch here because I'm going through a smaller area. And I want to be able to get a couple stitches in. I leave myself a little room so when I come up in the center, I have a place to go down next to it. Just pop my loop up to the top. Don't worry if you poke through your thread, your fabric a couple times trying to get your needle in the right spot. Those holes will close right up. Because we're going to give this a little bit of a steam press later on just to make sure everything's nice and get rid of all these little markings on it. And then that'll just take, like when you're sewing a quilt project, once you give it a little bit of an iron, all those little holes that you might have had when you pulled out threads because you sewed your seam wrong, they all kind of just close right up. Even with the little interfacing back here, because this is fusible, it still gets a little bit loose back there and it lets your cotton have room to move. Alright, so there's our stem stitch. Now on these little stitches, we're just going to come up by where the French knot is and then go down to here. And I'm going to do that at every one, because if I try to come up through here all the time, after I've had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6, however many you're doing, all going to that one spot, it's going to be hard to get up through the center. But it's real easy to poke down from the top. So even if I go up in my French knot spot, I can put my French knot a little bit past there because these are really short little stems there. Now actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change these to a lighter green. So I can easily just go to the back if I didn't like that stitch, just pull it right out. Go ahead and re-thread my needle. Now I'm just going to take my little, to weave my tail in, I'm going to do like I did before. I'm just going to go across this little space to these because the other one only had 2 stitches. And then I'll just weave it through. I'm going to leave a little bit, about 1/8 of an inch before when I trim off that tail. I don't want it to be flush right to the stitches, although you can if you'd like to. Now it says here that our French knots are going to be 2 strands. But since I'm going to be going ahead and I'm going to make these little strands here a light green, and I know that those need to be 3 strands, I'm just going to make my French knots with 3 strands. Because I can change my project up any way that works for me. And if I want to beeswax it, just go ahead and run it through. I've used this wax a lot. Sometimes colors will come off onto it, but I have never had a problem with it coming off onto my fabric. I've never heard any warnings about that, so I'm sure it's pretty fine. It's okay with that. But this piece has lasted me several times. I've made several projects with it now. And instead of using, like I said before, my whole piece and letting it dry up, I just cut a little chunk off of it. Keep this sealed up in the plastic that it came into so I can remember where to buy it again. And then I just use this little chunk. And if it gets dirty, I can go ahead, I believe they said you can go ahead and just wash it or let it heat up with your hands. And the warmth of your hands will go ahead and melt it back together. I'll just keep using that piece till it gets to be almost nothing. Now we're going to go ahead and do these little strands, and we're going to do our French knots in this little paler green, just so that this one has it all in one color, and then this way we can see what it looks like in a 2-tone. Even though we've already woven one end underneath there, I'm just going to go ahead and weave another end. And then I'm going to do it without pulling the thread all the way out the first time. Sometimes when I'm weaving, I like to catch the end of it, of the strand that I was weaving through. I like to hold the tail end of it a little bit and let it get caught underneath the strands as I'm doing it, just to give it a little bit of security. I think that's just my paranoia and it's not necessary, but if that's a little thing that makes you comfortable and happy, then you go ahead and do it. Now this is just going to be the straight stitch. And that's just where we're going to go up and down and just make one little line there. So come up where that little French knot is. I'll put the French knot at the end. It'll be okay. There's plenty of room here to add a French knot if I want to make this a little bit longer. And that's it. That's a straight stitch. Now something this small, you might not be able to see the fact that I used a second color, a little bit lighter. But we'll see what it looks like when we work on the longer one. Now I need to go from here to here. I can go that short distance, or I can flip it over and I can see through here that this is where I want to be. So I can take it back along this stem area and just pop it up through there. And now I'm not going to weave it anymore. I'm just going to take it straight from there to here. And that's going to keep me from having that itty bitty bit of a shadow that you probably wouldn't notice anyways. But it's a good little practice to do. And then once again, I'm going from the outer edges to the center so that it's easier to poke down here than it would be to try to come up through, because here we're putting 4 and we're probably stretching out the hole a little bit, so we're also getting the extra strand from there when we did our stem stitch. now we can go ahead and work our French knots. I can barely see that there's a second tone there when I'm looking through my normal eyes versus looking through the camera. But I think overall we might see the subtle shading as we get working through our project. So since I ended up here and I went down through the hole, I can start my French knots anywhere, and I'll probably start them over here and work my way this way. Now since I'm working on my actual project, I'm going to set this down on the table and see if I can get my knot nice and tight. Wrap it around twice, go back down through next to it. I'm going to hold it over here with my left hand while I peek underneath and pull my needle through. Nice and slow. And there's our first little French knot. Now it might look a little bit huge here, but I am zoomed in quite a lot. Come back in at the end of, I can come right back through the same hole that the end of this straight stitch was in. Twice around. Now you can change up if you like if you went twice around on these, you can go once or 3 times on these, but in the same flower right here, I think I want to keep it the same. That way they're all about this, that way they're all about the same size. I mean, they should be pretty much the same size because I'm using the same floss, the same amount of floss, the same types of wrapping it around, but maybe it might change a little bit depending on how tight I pull it. There's 3. You can see how we're pretty well covering up those dots. Now when we're all zoomed in, you can see I did leave a little bit more of a space there than I probably should have, but we're zoomed in super tight, and I can go through and I can take this light floss right here and I can just fill that spot in. And other than the fact that I've put this out on YouTube where anyone can see it, nobody's going to know that I made that little oops, right? So let me just sneak over to here, come up at the tail end, give that a little bit of a tug so it sucked down my French knot. And I'll just fill that in, and that'll cover that little bit of ink even though my iron will get rid of it. But now you can't see it at all. And I can just sneak right on over here and do these French knots. Now that's going to be it for this week's video. We're going to go ahead and work on another flower or leaves next week. I might try a different setup just so we can see what works. Maybe I'll try sitting at my desk where the sewing machine is. And I'll try out the little stand I have to see if that helps any. And you guys can let me know which one works better for you, and that's the one we can use going forward. Right there at the end of it. I just take it to the back and finish it off by weaving it underneath. See how easy it is to get it kind of a little bit messy back here? It doesn't take much because of all the times you're passing your floss through, and then when you're weaving it under your ends there to cover up your ends to tie off or to finish it off. Okay, there's 2 of our little green flowery type things. I still think they're kind of weeds. If you really want your French knots to stand out, you definitely want to try a different color. Like if you're using a dark green here, maybe use as pale as you possibly can, or you can put like maybe a yellow or a yellow green. We'll talk later about how you can mix. Since we're doing 3 strands, we can do like 2 greens and a yellow or 2 yellows and a green. We can pull them out and mix them that way. We might try that next time when we're working on, I think these might be really nice if we mixed a green and a yellow together to do these. That's called blending, using blending thread. Sometimes they call them a filament if they're kind of shiny, but we're just going to stick with the regular floss and blend them that way. If you want to give me a couple things that you had a hard time seeing, if you do have a suggestion, if you make videos like this, I'd love to hear how you do them. Next week, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and try sitting at the desk. I'll go ahead and bring out my stand, and maybe we'll be able to figure out a way if I have it hanging off the desk in my lap or something so that we can see a little bit better. But I didn't want to wait any longer, and I didn't want to keep trying different things, so I wanted to make sure I got another video up for you guys because you've already waited 2 weeks to get to this video. We only did the 2 here this week, but since we were doing a stem stitch, anywhere if you want to do any of these stems, you can go ahead and work without me and go ahead and do any of the stems you want. But throughout this process, we are going to stitch this entire thing together, even if we already know all the stitches and we're just chatting while I stitch them to get all caught up. Okay guys, thanks for hanging out with me today. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!